All right, today we're talking about how to niche down into technology services. If you are maybe a digital marketing agency, you're listening to this. We've got lots of digital marketing agencies that listen to this show, and you've got that sweet recurring revenue, and you're thinking about, oh, do I need to niche down or not? This conversation will be great for you. My guest today is Brendon Dennewill. I'll tell you more about him in a second, so stay tuned.
Welcome to the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where we feature top entrepreneurs, business leaders, and thought leaders and ask them how they built key relationships to get where they are today. Now, let's get started with the show.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corcoran here. I'm the host of this show, and every week we talk to smart CEOs, founders, and entrepreneurs from all kinds of companies. We've had Netflix and Grubhub, Gusto, Kinko's, YPO, EO, Activation, Blizzard, and so many more. Check out the archives. And of course, this episode brought to you by Rise 25, where we help businesses to give to and connect to their dream relationships and partnerships. How do we do that? We do that by helping you to run your podcast. We are the easy button for a company to launch and run a podcast. We do three things: strategy, accountability, and full execution. And Brendon, I know for you, you know the importance of relationships, having reinvented your career many times, and we're going to get into that whole story around there. But I found that it's critical to have someone who's got your back, who's going to help you. And we like to joke that our company is like the team of magic elves behind the scenes to allow you to do the things that you do so well. And so for me, the number one thing in my life has been relationships, and I'm always looking for great ways to give to my relationships. And I found no better way than to do what we're doing here, which is to, feature people and hear their stories. So if you want to learn more about that, go to our website, rise25.com, or email us at support@rise25.com. But let me tell you about Brendon, because he's the CEO and co-founder of Denamico, which is a HubSpot solutions partner. And he's got 30 plus year career across 6 different countries, 3 continents, 4 languages, amazing background. He started his story in South Africa and Namibia. Actually, it was Southwest Africa was the name of the country that he was born in at the time. And I want to hear all about this, Brendon, because it really has a lot to do with what you're doing today and how you choose to spend your time now. But you grew up in Southwest Africa, which later, after apartheid fell, became part of South Africa. And you're surrounded by entrepreneurship, actually. It's a very entrepreneurial country. Why do you think South Africa, of all the countries on earth, has such a phenomenal reputation for entrepreneurship?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting question, which I don't think about all that often. But unfortunately, I think one of the reasons was because of the sanctions that happened during apartheid, where South Africa, which at that point included, to your earlier comment, included Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia. They had to figure out how to do things for themselves and supply and manufacture everything that they needed, because there were no other options.
Yeah.
And that is, and I think South Africans seem to be very resourceful, even before that. But I think unfortunately that was one of the few benefits that came from the sanctions that led from apartheid, that people had to figure it out for themselves. And I think that's just continued. Again, that culture has continued through to today.
Yeah, it's interesting. And your father actually started multiple different entrepreneurial businesses. Tell me a little bit about those.
Yeah, I guess, he would probably say that it was luck, like so many successful people say, what happened was he actually worked for a company literally from the bottom up, packing. He was a longshoreman, which, for those of you listening to the news lately, there's been stories about longshoremen in LA and other places potentially striking because they want more money. But they're the folks that literally pack the things onto the ships. And this was before containerization. So they were manually, loading sacks of whatever and boxes onto ships to go to different places.
So heavy duty labor.
Heavy duty labor. Obviously, we lived in a port town, which, even though it's one of the most remote places on the planet, because it was a port city, I saw and met people from all over the world, so I never felt isolated, even though when you look at it on a map, or you try to get there any other way than by ship, it is very remote.
Mm.
But anyway, he worked his way up literally from the bottom of the company to becoming the CEO in his mid 30s. And after about 30 years of essentially just running the business, when Namibia became independent, one of the first things that they did was they told all the fishing fleets from all around the world that had been fishing there for decades. They said, well, you can continue fishing in our very rich, nutrient waters in the South Atlantic of Namibia, but you have to have at least 50% local ownership.
Mm.
And of course, my father through this business had been the agent for all these companies for almost 30 years. And they were friends. They had very deep relationships with all these people. And of course, whether they were, Russian or Spanish or Japanese, you name it. And those were finally the three nationalities that approached him and said, will you be our partner? And when the Japanese came along, he was like, oh, sure. And he got together three of his work buddies that were in slightly different businesses and said, would you guys? I don't want to do this on my own, but if you guys want to join me, then we could make this happen. So the Japanese deal was pretty easy, and then the Spanish came along, and the same thing, they made it happen. And then the Russians came along, and that was a little more complicated, but they figured it out, and that actually became so because the Russian, the Soviet Union fell around at the same time, but they essentially did a joint venture with the big Sovrib, it was called, the Soviet fishing fleet. Which eventually became one of the most successful companies in the country, and that was the last 10 to 20 years of his career were very much more entrepreneurial, but of course was set up by being in the right place at the right time and making his own luck.
Fortunate, I guess, in a sense that he had worked for the right company and that opportunity came later, because you could work for a company for 30, 40 years and not get any ownership stake. Now,
Absolutely.
You ended up doing some work for your father for some of these businesses later. What was that like?
Yeah, so I never actually worked for him directly, but through some of these companies, and then through that partnership, they actually started a duty-free business with a Swiss company as a partner. But my first job was actually working for one of these companies that, exporting all their fish from Southern Africa. So they eventually had operations in Namibia and in Cape Town in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked for them for a couple of years doing all their export business. And then they acquired this duty-free partnership, and they asked me if I'd move over to run that, which I did for 6 years. And then they realized that wasn't really part of their core business and wanted to get out of it. So I sort of worked an additional 6 months through the transition to the new owner. And then they asked me to go back to the fishing side, which was essentially to understudy the CEO of the whitefish operation back in Namibia. The rest of the time I was actually based in Cape Town, which I saw as a great opportunity, and was actually dating my now wife at the time. And knowing this little town where I'd grown up, I knew that I liked the opportunity, but I didn't like going back there as a single guy. And so I said to Kristen, I'll take this job if you agree to move there with me, which she did. She eventually left her, very, very great job at McKinsey in Madrid and moved to Namibia with me. And anyway, the rest, as they say, is history. We were married a year later and had, all three of our kids were born there. But then, as the business progressed, we actually realized that it wasn't going to be a great business for us. And I was.
Why is that?
Primarily because of the way that, so in fishing in most countries are based on a quota system.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in Africa, which is, I guess, somewhat understandable, um, the, the intention there was continuously to pass more of the quota to less fortunate people. But unfortunately, the folks who were ending up with the quota didn't actually have the boats or the ships to catch the fish.
Mm.
So they would get the quota and then come to us and sell us the quota back.
You'd buy the rights to go fishing. Yeah.
Correct. But
Okay.
of course,
Okay.
our margins just kept getting smaller, and we didn't know from one year to the next how much we would actually get.
Mm.
So not a great business model when you
Yeah.
have no control over your upside, right?
Yeah.
So we ended up making the decision, and it took probably 2 years to happen, but to sell the business. I was part of the management team. And then when that deal was done, Kristen and I were there with, a one year old, a 2 year old, and a 3 year old, and we were like, now what do we do? And Spain had always been our sort of neutral territory and neutral ground. That's actually where we were married because it was kind of halfway between the US, where she's originally from, and all of our friends in Africa and Europe. So we decided to move to Mallorca, Spain. So it's the island of Mallorca in the Mediterranean.
Not a bad place.
It was not bad at all. In fact, when we arrived there, so we moved there in 2007, on what we now reflect on as the crest of the wave. It was a great time.
The economic rave, you mean the
Yeah, like, life was great. I mean, it was 2007 was a great time,
mhm.
even in Spain. And then we were like, well, so what are we going to do? And we decided to start a real estate business, which I guess the most similar thing that you would equate it to here is a residential real estate broker.
Mhm.
But the way that it works in Spain is it's a lot more complicated because, again, first of all, we were living on an island, and our business was based on foreigners who wanted to buy, fairly valuable properties on the island. So, anywhere from sort of $2 to $10 million, as sort of a second home or what have you. And they were looking for more efficient ways to do that, which we created a system for them to do that. And it was actually, it took us about a year and a half to build it, and it was going really well until the '08 crisis hit.
Mm.
And
People
yeah,
stopped buying real estate. Yeah, at that
and
point.
and yeah, I mean, the business was pretty much done in about 48 hours.
Oh, geez. Wow.
So it was a rough time. But
What about for
as
you? I mean, that's an interesting pivot from managing fishery businesses to real estate. Tell me a little bit about that. Like, what gave you the confidence to completely pivot from one completely different industry? What gave you the know-how? There's a lot of people who would be like, I can't switch. This is all I've ever known. I can't switch to something completely different like that. And in this beautiful
yeah,
island in the Mediterranean.
yeah. I mean, well, I mean, it turns out Kristen and I are both fairly entrepreneurial. Her father built his own business with a partner in the real estate industry here in the US. And I guess through seeing what he had done, that was partly part of what played into our interest in real estate.
So that gave you
But
kind of some confidence going into it.
yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. Just having more context as to how the industry works. Of course, what we weren't expecting was, one of the biggest financial crises,
Yeah.
in 3 decades or whatever it was. And but in hindsight, which of course is always that much easier, we realized, we realize now that it was the greatest opportunity because 2008 was also a turning point in so many ways. Some of it related to the '08 crisis, and some of it not. From a technology perspective, where the iPhone had just become a thing, Facebook had just become a thing, and anyway, so as I was, clearly very concerned about what had just happened, losing the real estate business. What one does in that situation is you call every friend and family member who will meet you or have a conversation or a coffee, and
See what you can do.
see what
How
see
it can
see
help.
what advice they have.
Right.
And pretty much everybody, said to me, just go back to what you like doing and what you're good at, which is really, business, but thinking more about it. So in my experience in the fishing, when I was running the fishing business, the my what I spent most of my time doing was all on the marketing and the packaging and the exporting of the fish, but also running a lot of the operations. But I always lent towards the sales and marketing aspect. And one friend of mine in particular, who was a South African living in Mallorca too, said to me, "You should check out this whole digital online marketing world. It's quite fascinating." And of course, I went home that evening and took his advice, and in about an hour of research, realized that he was definitely onto something, and it seemed right up my alley. And sort of dove into it head first, and essentially hung up my shingle as a solo consultant because coming back to the Facebook and the iPhone and how Google search was developing, I realized that there were so many small and mid-sized businesses out there who were going to want to figure this out,
Yeah.
and would need help. So it didn't take me long to figure out how to do that. And in fact, Kristen decided to start a home staging business. Again, thinking that might be a solution to the real estate market where we were living, which was just crumbling really, really fast.
Is this still in Mallorca
In
or
Spain? Yeah,
okay,
Mallorca, Spain.
Okay.
Which for those folks who listening who don't know, Spain was one of the worst hit countries by the '08 crisis.
Yeah.
It's a relatively small market, relative to the US, but there were 1 million new homes that were unsold at the time
Wow.
that the crisis hit. So
Wow.
that just took, a lot of the banks and of course the real estate developers and companies and the people who were making the investments down with it.
So
Um,
I know you then shortly after that moved to the United States. At what point
well, it
did
was
you
a couple
just,
of years. Yeah, it was a
okay.
couple. So what happened is, Kristen started this home staging business called Mallorca Home Staging. And she became a client of mine. And the next thing we knew, we owned the first page of Google for all things home staging,
Mm.
to the point where the Spanish national news called us or called her and said, "Oh, we'd like to interview you because no one in Spain is familiar with home staging." This
Mm.
is back in '09, I guess.
So was it still taking an idea that was more popular like in the States and bringing it there? Yeah.
Correct,
Yeah.
correct. And anyway, so it was interesting, but realized that wasn't moving the real estate market either. So later that year in 2000, so it was 2009, Kristen and I were chatting and saying, we have very complementary skills and strengths. Why don't we, get together and build a business together? And at this point, what I had started seemed had a lot more legs and a lot fewer limitations. And that's when we also decided we needed to, give a name to this thing. And we had a friend who was an ex-razorfish strategist who was, an Englishman living on the island as well. And he said, "Oh, well, I can help you figure that out." And so we went, he invited us up. He lived up the street from us, and his office was his garage, because of course the weather there is amazing. So every morning he'd open up his garage, and there was his office, and we sat in there, and he pulled out his whiteboard, and we did the exercise in both English and Spanish, because all the work we were doing was typically in at least two, but often three or four languages.
Mm.
Because on the island they speak Spanish, Catalan, and then there's a huge German and English presence. So you were
Mm.
typically doing things in those languages.
Mm.
But we decided to do this exercise in two languages, English and Spanish. And the word that very quickly floated to the top of the board was the Spanish word for dynamic, which is Denamico.
Oh,
And,
cool.
and that was prompted by Neil, our friend, asking us the question continuously, well, what is it that you're going to be helping your clients with and do? And we said, oh, we're going to help them navigate the changes in their business that will come from changes in technology,
Mm.
and how they will stay connected to their customers.
Mm.
And so it was this sort of this whole thing of this dynamic nature of how business was going to have to evolve over the, in the future.
So,
And it's been very consistent.
so I'm curious. So I can see how you had the vision, you had the background, you've done sales and marketing for the fishery business, and then the real estate market drops out, and so you're interested and you hear there's this opportunity with marketing, with digital marketing, so you start doing that. How did you get clients? How did you find clients that were interested in hiring you for these services?
I mean, not that different to how we would do it today, really. Um, it was networking, and then of course promoting, our own business online, which we got fairly good at. However, with the Spanish economy just getting worse and worse, 2010 was terrible, and then 2011 was even worse. There was just no sign of a recovery, and we actually happened to be back in South Africa, in Cape Town, for Christmas of 2011 with my family. And of course, as we always did when we went back there, was get together with all my friends and this was kind of the moment where all our South African friends were saying to us, wow, Spain's really in bad shape, right? And we looked at each other and we went, oh my God, what are we doing?
Yeah.
Because we love the lifestyle. I mean, the lifestyle there is unbelievable, but we realized that moment that it was time to make a move.
Yeah.
And we got back to Mallorca, like a week later was, I guess the first week of 2012. And I had a trip to Madrid, and Kristen and I had spoken, and she sat down with the kids, and told her, sort of told them we planned this to make it think that was their idea, that we were going to go and live with grandma and grandpa in Minneapolis, because they'd visited many times, because we'd alternate Christmases between Cape Town with my family and Minneapolis with her family. And of course, the kids at this point are 5, 6, and 7, and they were like, oh, that sounds exciting, that's great. So we had them think it was their idea, and then on February 29th we arrived in Minnesota.
Leap year.
It was a leap year, 2012. And but again, so Denamico isn't necessarily the easiest name to pronounce in the US, especially if you're English speaking. But we just haven't found a good reason yet to change the name.
It's distinctive. It's different. Yeah. So then,
and it's very true to what we started with and what we still do, which is help businesses navigate the change that comes with technology, and just being in this very dynamic space.
Right. And so you've really had to evolve and change. You started as kind of general digital marketing services. And then I believe it was around 2014, you decided to hook your train, so to speak, to the HubSpot train and evolve with them. And so talk a little bit about that decision and that evolution.
Yeah. So in those first 2 years, being in the US, which of course, Kristen had been gone for 19 years, pretty much her entire professional life. I had zero, network here. We figured out, through networking and what have you, we figured out how to get some clients. But we very quickly realized that there was something missing, from a systems perspective. As our clients became more sophisticated. And we actually got a call from a HubSpot sales rep in probably March of 2014. And up until that point, we've been following a company in Minneapolis called Magnet 360 that had hitched their wagon to Salesforce. And we were like, wow, that's whatever they're doing seems to be working. And then this call came from HubSpot, and we were like, tell us more. And we pretty much signed up, the next week. So we became a partner in April of 2014. And that same year, at that point, HubSpot was a marketing platform, but they were already working on their very, basic CRM. But as they evolved the product and became more of a full suite, about 6 years ago, we realized that there was kind of a fork in the road, and we had to make a choice to were we going to be, because we were doing more and more, large scale implementations of HubSpot, and we felt we had to make a choice because we felt like we were running two businesses, a marketing services business and then a technology implementation business. And it wasn't a difficult choice for us. It'll be different for everybody who's in that situation, but we decided that we wanted to focus on the CRM technology implementations and integrations part. And but then the hard part was letting go of the marketing services because the retained revenue there
Right.
was
Yeah.
very, very interesting and very hard to let go of. But the hardest part really was realizing that we were going to need very different people to run the technology business than we had. We had all these incredibly smart marketing folks before, and we just assumed that they would make the switch. And of course,
No.
they're different people.
Yeah.
So that was the part that we had not really thought through, and that was the hardest part to navigate.
Yeah.
But in hindsight, we still know that it was the right move, and we feel really good
Yeah.
about it now.
Now, I over the course of my career has made the opposite switch because I was an attorney practicing law 15 years ago, and that's very transactional, short-term projects for a month or two, and then it ends.
Mhm.
Um, sometimes the benefit can be it can be very profitable, but it's very stressful too because you don't have longer-term engagements. So
Sure.
you switched from longer-term engagements to shorter-term engagements. I assume the trade-off is they paid a lot more, or there was a higher volume of people who are looking for HubSpot services.
Yeah, well, and it's not exactly, I mean, our goal was never not to be in the recurring revenue business anymore. It was just we didn't know what recurring revenue services looked like in the CRM space.
Mm,
Now we've introduced those services because the reality is when we implement, or when a company implements a CRM, and if especially if they have it across marketing, sales, and customer service, and have it then integrated with an ERP or whatever other integrations they have. It's very seldom just a set it up and forget it kind of
yeah,
deal.
they're going to need some kind of ongoing support. Yeah,
Exactly. And that's where, again, the recurring support that we provide to our customers, again, has come back. But
yeah.
there were a couple of years there where, we had to say goodbye to some decent revenue.
But now, this is a challenge that every business runs into when they're in this kind of transition. Do you, at some point, just tell the old clients that we can't serve you anymore? You got to find someone else to help you, or do you just let them kind of winnow away, and eventually you look up one day and you've got one or two left or none left?
Yeah, no, we were very proactive about it, and we started looking for. And it's one of the amazing things about becoming more focused as a business is that you suddenly see opportunities for partnerships everywhere, right?
Mm,
And because again, we knew who our competitors were when we provided marketing services, and we knew who the good ones were. And so it became really easy for us to recommend alternative agencies for the
yeah.
clients of ours who really just needed the marketing support.
And you could,
Uh,
I imagine you could then partner with them because you're niching down into something you're no longer competitive with those other marketing agencies.
yeah, if that was relevant, then yes. But
Mm,
what's also happened is we've started working with bigger businesses than we used to work on the marketing side.
mm,
But we actually still have a couple of clients where we started 8 years ago on providing the marketing services, but using HubSpot as kind of their core system, and they've continued to see the benefit of obviously of having HubSpot. And I'm thinking about one in particular where they don't have a marketing agency, and we don't provide any marketing services. It's just everything is kind of done
mhm.
through the HubSpot work that we do for them.
So for this big decision, do you remember, were there points where you were like, oh crap, this was a bad decision. We shouldn't have done this? Or are you just
No,
kind of like, are you a positive person, just kind of full speed ahead? I can't think about that.
yeah, it's funny, because we've done two transcontinental moves as a family, and if you go further back, there've been a few more. But for example, when we moved from Africa to Europe, or from Europe to the US, and all the friends that we had in each of those places obviously knew what was going on. They were like, "Oh my gosh, how do you do that? How do you just pack up and move to another continent. But for us, it was always the excitement of the adventure
Mm.
and making the decision, and just there was never any looking back. It was just really more of, how are we going to make this work versus did we do the right thing?
Yeah, that's great. Speaking of
Yeah.
not looking back, one interesting thing that you did recently is you and your wife became empty nesters and you decided to do a freebird trip, which I love that term after dropping off
Hmm.
your youngest at college, going back
Right.
to your roots to Africa, and you actually helped some local schools that you'd been involved with through a nonprofit that you're involved with. Talk a little bit about that. That's so cool that you did this.
Yeah. So, kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier. So when we moved to Minneapolis, I didn't know anybody. So, and whether this was socially or from a business perspective, so I joined a few different, networking type groups, one of which was, really amazing for me, which was Rotary. I joined the Minneapolis Rotary Club.
Yeah, great organization.
Yeah. And um, anyway, so I was very happy to be there. And I was probably there for about 6 months when someone came over to me who I hadn't met before. And he said, "Oh, I heard, you grew up in Southern Africa. Um, can we talk?" And I'm like, "Sure, tell me more." And it turns out he was the founder of Africa Classroom Connection. So he was on a trip in South Africa once, and he happened to be sitting at a restaurant with some people next to some people who were in a local Rotary club in KwaZulu in South Africa, and they got chatting, and they were like, "Oh yeah, this is kind of one of the main projects that we work on." And he's like, "Oh, great. I'm going to set up an organization in Minnesota, and I'm going to help you."
Mm.
So, and this was back in 2006. So it'll be, we'll be celebrating the 20-year anniversary next year for that. And yeah, so he started, a nonprofit here, 501(c)(3), raising funds. And every time we have enough funds, we send the funds over to our local partners in South Africa, who all happen to be Rotary members, but they also have another nonprofit base there that then figures out how to get the classrooms built or added to a school, and all the administration of, because the deal that they have with the government is that if we build a school, you'll provide the teacher. And that's kind of how that works. And it was just incredibly rewarding after, doing this work for 8 years for me to finally go and visit some of these schools, because every school, every classroom that we build educates 50 kids per year.
Mhm.
So we know that, a classroom that we built, 19 or 20 years ago, cumulatively has now educated almost 1,000 kids that would not have had a classroom if it wasn't for this organization. And if they were lucky, they might find a teacher who would, sit under a tree on days when it's not too hot or
Oh,
raining.
wow. Wow. Yeah.
So just to see the impact that these kids will have from having an education is yeah,
That's
it's
so
quite
cool.
incredible.
That's
Yeah,
so cool that you did that. Really neat. We're almost out of time, so I want to wrap up with my gratitude question. I'm a big fan of gratitude, especially expressing gratitude to others
likewise.
who've helped you in your journey. I wanted to give you the opportunity to shout out anyone in particular, any peers, contemporaries, mentors that have helped you in your journey.
Wow, man, there's so many. Um, well, I guess I didn't forget it. I mean, a lot of them were like, if I go back to my earliest, Mrs. McDonald, who was my, I guess here would be like, you know, grade 2 teacher or whatever. Um, I even forget what she did, but I guess she gave me a lot of confidence. And then in middle school as well, I had another teacher who again gave me a lot of responsibility. Um, and then a big one at that same time when I was in the choir school. Um, I was there for 3 years because you age out at a certain age. In the second year that I was there, the choir master came over to me, and I'd never been in a leadership role of any kind by that point, and never thought I would be. And he said to me, Brendon, I'd like you to be the head of the choir. In other words, so, I'm essentially the president of the choir or the general manager of the choir, whatever. And I was like, oh my gosh, because I'd always looked up to the two guys that were in that role before me as being true leaders. So that was a really big one for me. And that probably kept me going for a few years. And then in my, I guess in my professional life, I also had mentors who I've learned a lot from. The one I worked for in the fishing company, he taught me a lot of the things that I didn't yet know. And of course, I still learn every day. I'm currently very indebted to and grateful for my Vistage network. That again, that's been an incredible
Great
support
community
for me. And then 3 years ago, I also joined the Strategic Coach community, which has also been an incredible way to
Dan
learn.
Sullivan. Yeah. Great community.
In fact, his book is probably one of the best books I've read on gratitude, which is The Gap and the Gain.
Oh yeah. And Who Not How, I think, is another one that he has. Brendon, this has been great. Where can people go to learn more about you and connect with you? I know you have Denamico, of course, and
Denamico.com. And
Africa Classroom Connection and the RevOps Champions podcast. Anywhere else they can go to learn more about you?
I guess LinkedIn. LinkedIn
Perfect.
is probably another good place.
Perfect. All right, Brendon, thank you so much for your time.
John, thank you so much for having me on the show.
Thanks for listening to the Smart Business Revolution podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.